Grandpa was 97 years old when he passed away. He lived far from where his 3 children had settled. Grandma died when I was a small child, and he ended up remarrying another woman a few years later who demanded that he move out west so that she could be nearer to her sons. She was a piece of work, was Grandma Hester. We all wondered how Grandpa could stand her. It turns out that perhaps he could not. We're not precisely sure when he developed dementia, but it was probably years before we noticed it. He'd tell us about people he was speaking to, or visiting with, or a trip he took. Years later, after we learned that he was suffering from dementia, we'd learn that conversation, that visit, or that trip never actually happened. For all we really know, any story he told us from the last decade and a half leading up to his coming back east could be a false memory. We would have no way of knowing. Hester rarely communicated with us herself. Probably our first clue that Grandpa wasn't himself anymore happened a few weeks after he came back east to live with my parents. Most of the family had settled in one area. My wife and I lived in the south end of our city, as did one set of our cousins, but my father and his 2 sisters all lived to the north, within driving distance of each other. A few of my aunt's children had moved out of town, and my brother had as well, but there were still enough of us around that Grandpa could visit with. We would often have gatherings at my parents' house, where Grandpa would either hold court with some story, or would go to sleep. One afternoon, my daughter Brianne, who was in her late teens at the time, came in from playing with my cousin's kids, and sat down at the table where Grandpa had been napping. He suddenly woke and smiled at her. "Well, hello, Claudia," he said brightly. Claudia was my aunt, Dad's youngest sister. "I'm Brianne, Grandpa," said my daughter. "No," said Grandpa, almost sounding offended. "You're my daughter, Claudia." Later that same month, he told my aunts and uncles the story of how he came out east after living with Hester got to be too much. "I prayed to the Lord," said Grandpa, "and the next thing I knew, Martin was there." Martin was my father. I remembered him driving out to the tiny cold house on a hill in Colorado to get Grandpa. He had not come due to any divine intervention. He had come because Grandpa called him in the night and pleaded with him to come get him. We all loved Grandpa, but caring for him was not easy. For one thing, Grandpa had gotten it into his head that he was a young, single man with many years ahead of him, and the only thing missing was a young woman at his side. If he spoke for any length of time with a younger woman, he became convinced that she was in love with him, and that perhaps she could be his new bride. Hester was even still alive at this point. He had forgotten her utterly. The women he made advances on included my mother, 2 of my cousins, and my own wife. Thankfully, he couldn't do much more than talk, so it was just a matter of politely changing the subject whenever he could start with that. But it got worse when he decided he could do things like take walks on his own or try to drive my father's car. Dad and Mum didn't let him go on walks by himself, but that didn't mean he didn't sneak away sometimes when Dad was away and Mum was in the basement. He had to use a walker to get around, and simply couldn't do stairs, but refused to admit this to anyone, including himself, leading to a lot of falls. He would also get confused as to where he was or where he lived. At times, during his walks, he would attempt to find the old family home that he raised my father and aunts in, despite it having been long gone since before I was born. Dad picked him up from a police station, where he had been taken after some patrol officers saw him wandering around, clearly lost. The time he tried to drive Dad's car was after that. He decided that the reason he got lost is because he had to walk. He managed to get the e-brake off and rolled right down the fairly steep incline outside my parents' house, crashing into a fence. The damage was minimal, but after that incident, my parents realized he needed to be in a full-time care facility. He got worse after that. My father visited him 3 times a week. I have no idea how often my aunts went, or even if they did. I tended to only go when there was a family gathering, and increasingly, I began to realize that he had no clue who I was. He'd smile and greet me as though I was someone he had just met. He'd tell me about his children, describing them as little kids, and even going as far as to invent a friend who was looking after them while he was in his home with all these old people. Grandpa was 93 at the time. He was much older than many of the others who lived there, but somehow they were the old people, while he was not. But when I say he got worse, I mean he changed. The false memories, the refusal to acknowledge that he was elderly, the attempts to chat up ladies, and inability to remember that his children were grown, and that he had grandchildren and great-grandchildren, had been a part of who he was for years, ever since his early 80s. But he had never been violent before. That changed one night when Dad was called to come to the facility quickly. Grandpa had wandered into the wrong room and had come out screaming, raising his walker up in the air and slamming it into the ground, taking a few swings at people who tried to calm him down. He began accusing the staff of stealing his things. He was bellowing as loud as he could, "Give them back! Give them back!" I wasn't there for it, and I still have a hard time picturing it. Grandpa barely raised his voice above normal volume during the last decade of his life, except to laugh. When Dad got there, they had gotten him into his room, and he was somewhat appeased. Somewhat. He had a can of Ensure in a tube sock, and almost hit my father in the head with it when he came in. He apologized. Dad was one of the people he always recognized, and said he had been waiting for the thief to come back. A man who'd steal from me just as soon kill me, he explained. The Ensure in a sock was his weapon to fend off the thief. He told Dad about the men who had come to give him all his things back. They put it all back, just like it was, he said. Didn't take 'em long. Later that night, he told Dad about how much it had scared Florence. He hated that she'd had to go through that. Florence was my grandmother, the one who died when I was 6. He finished by saying that Florence had gone somewhere, and when he went looking for her, they told me she was dead. One day they're going to come looking for me, and they're going to find me dead. That was a jolt to my father. Grandpa had never, at any point before that, acknowledged his mortality, his advanced age, or the fact that he had probably no more than a handful of years left at best. Aging and death was something that happened to other people, but here he was, accepting that death was near. That wasn't the last night he mentioned the thief. He even gave the thief a name, Charlie Rosen. It was strange that he would invent a whole person, name included. He didn't even name the friend who was looking after his kids. In fact, that person ceased to exist. Charlie Rosen had stolen his kids, had killed Florence, had come to his home in Colorado and routinely taunted him, beat him, and he even declared that Hester had been sleeping with him. He remembered her now, and was certain that she and Charlie were ganging up on him to make his life a living hell. In the last 6 months of his life, he would become increasingly agitated. Dad could not have a single visit wherein Grandpa would not mention Charlie, and then the violence started up again. In one visit, Grandpa accused Dad of being Charlie and attacked him. After that, Dad's visits dropped to once a week, and he didn't stay long. Once I went with him. It was the last time I saw my grandfather alive, and I will never forget it. "Charlie was here again today," Grandpa told us as soon as we arrived. "He told me I couldn't leave this room anymore. He's trapped me here." "Dad, this is where you live," my father tried to explain. "See, here's a picture of Mother. Why would Charlie let you keep that?" "He killed your mother, you know," said Grandpa. "Murdered her in her sleep." "Mother had an aneurysm," said Dad. "You and I decided together to unplug the machine. She died in her sleep. No one killed her." No, it was Charlie." Grandpa's voice was not agitated. It was solid, like he knew for a fact what he was saying. "He poisoned her, made something go wrong in her head. I didn't know it then, but I realized it later, after he introduced me to Hester. Conned me into marrying her. He's my personal demon, that Charlie." Dad finally had enough. "There is no Charlie," he said, nearly shouting. "You aren't supposed to correct people who have dementia. It just confuses them more and makes them upset." But my father forgot this in that moment. "Charlie is someone you made up. Mother died naturally. You met Hester at a coffee shop years after Mother died. And while she was not a nice woman, she was not unfaithful to you. Please, stop talking about Charlie." "Dear Lord in heaven," said Grandpa. "He got to you. He told you to say these things. You're part of it too." Grandpa," I said, "why don't we start a game of checkers?" Usually, he loved checkers. "I don't want to play any bloody checkers," screamed Grandpa. I couldn't have been more surprised if he had hit me. Grandpa had never used profanity in his life. Bywords, as he called them, were only used by bad men as far as he was concerned. "Not with you, not with him. Charlie Rosen's pet demons. He comes to me every day. He talks to me about Florence. He taunts me. He reads my mind and he takes thoughts away and puts in new ones, worse ones. He tells me about how he rapes my little ones, how he and Hester keep them half-starved and chained in their basement. I can't stop him. He can go inside my mind. He's controlling me." We left after that, without saying goodbye. Driving home, I almost wanted to cry. This kind, loving man was ending his days as a raving, violent lunatic. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. What kind of monster was Charlie? That thought stopped me cold. For an instant, I had accepted that Charlie was real. Giving my head a shake, I resolved to think about something else. But an image of Charlie had been forming in my mind beginning a few months back when Grandpa had first started talking about him. I only now realized that when Grandpa spoke of this demonic man, I was picturing him in my mind, and I could see him as clearly as I could see memories of real people. I thought of the last time I had visited Grandpa in that tiny house in the mountains of Colorado when I was a teenager, sitting at that little round table while Hester served us some of her inedible glop, and I would see a man standing in the corner of a kitchen watching us eat. A tall, gangly man with leathery skin stretched over sharp-looking bone and corded muscle. Shaggy, grey hair hanging down, obscuring the upper part of his face. His smile stretching like a knife slashed across his jaw. I thought of the wedding. I was 12 years old. I met Hester for the first time, and standing a ways behind her was that same man. I remember a family gathering at the facility Grandpa was concurrently staying at. Didn't we pass that man in the hall once? No, of course not. These were just images my mind had cooked up. The more Grandpa talked about this shady character that never existed. The brain can do that. Insert false people in your memory just because you decide, subconsciously, to remember them. It doesn't mean you're insane. It's just another way for your brain to play tricks on you. Grandpa had invented a person who he talked about with such conviction, as though Charlie was real. So my mind had conjured up a Charlie Rosen, but there was no Charlie Rosen. Grandpa died 2 months later. I remember the funeral like it was yesterday. I still wake up at night in a cold sweat, remembering. Everything was normal at the start. My parents, my aunts, my uncles, my wife and I, and our children, my brother and his wife and their son, my cousins, their spouses and their children. We all gathered under the same roof for the first time in years. No one was missing. No one was out of town and couldn't make it. 2 of my cousins I hadn't seen since they were children. It was nice to catch up with them. The service was nice as well. The pastor, who served the spiritual needs at Grandpa's facility, was the officiator. Grandpa looked calm and peaceful, whole, so unlike what he had been in the last few months of his life. I started to feel calm myself. Grandpa was where he belonged now, where the devils of his own fevered, decaying brain couldn't get to him anymore. And then we drove to the cemetery. The coffin was lowered. We all sprinkled a handful of dirt on the coffin and began our walk back to the cars. And then the gravedigger come out of the shadows to start shoveling the rest of the dirt. I could barely read the embroidered name tag on his coveralls. It looked like C. Rose, or C. Risen? Or no, it couldn't be. He was tall, gangly, with leathery skin, sharp-looking bones, corded muscle, long grey hair, and that smile that haunts my nightmares to this day. I watched as this phantom dumped shovelful after shovelful of dirt on my grandfather's coffin. He was laughing softly under his breath, but I have never heard such cruel laughter. Today, I felt like I had to write all this down to make sure I remember it all before things get worse. Because today, my father called me to complain that Charlie was driving past his house, and staring in his windows.
We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Julius Oppenheimer on the first atomic bomb.
That quote comes to mind while watching Sergio Canavero work. When performing surgery, he becomes so mesmerized by the task that myself and his other assistants become indistinguishable from his steel instruments, born and bred for the sole moment when he has need of us. Even the patient isn't a human being anymore, just a puzzle to be deciphered or discarded when the last piece finally breaks. I thought it was the greatest honor in the world when the neurosurgeon accepted my application to join his team. Despite the international controversy over the ethics of head transplants, I knew that I was going to become part of history. I wasn't embarrassed to tell my family what I was doing either. They were proud of the honor I was doing for China. Our president, Xi Jinping, is sanctioning the experimental procedure because he is determined to replace the US as the world leader in science, and it was my privilege to perform on that global stage. Dr. Canavero has explained and rehearsed the procedure with us over the last several months, but this was more rigorous than any of my classes at Peking University. Essentially, we will be simultaneously severing the spinal cords of the donor and the recipient with a diamond-edge blade. The donor head will be cooled to a state of deep hypothermia to keep the neurological tissue from dying during the transfer. By the end of the 24-hour operation, we will have reconnected all vertebral bones, nerve endings, veins, trachea, everything. The patient will then be suspended in a drug-induced coma until he is healed enough to move on his own. And then, there's going to be a brand new person with a whole new life to live. Those who are languished in a paralyzed body will be able to walk. Healthy minds trapped by the ravages of age can be restored to youth. And the very notion of mortality and individuality and the soul itself will be forever changed. That's the best case scenario, of course. There is also the chance that the surgery will fail, and we will have sacrificed 2 people to the altar of our arrogance. More than that, though, failure would likely show our best intentions in a macabre light, prejudicing the world against us and our research for decades to come. So many eyes on us, on China. So many judgments and condemnations. The pressure was intense. I could feel it in the air the second I stepped into Dr. Cavanero's laboratory each morning. No one smiled, and if they did, it was a thin, bloodless line that died almost before it began. As we approached the operation date, the other 2 assistants and I were drilled incessantly on every potential obstacle. 1 second of hesitation during the operation, and we would be ostracized from all official institutions which sought to distance themselves from our failure. Flashcards, pop tests, rehearsals on dummies, endless study. But we were still months away from the official operation when I received a phone call at 1 a.m. "You'll be using the back door tonight." Dr. Canavero didn't even wait for me to say hello. "It will be unlocked. Don't bring any identification, and tell no one where you will be. Officially speaking, nothing that you do or see tonight will ever have happened." What's going on? Is this about I managed before being cut off with an impatient hiss? Of course it's about the operation. Stop wasting time. We have a long night ahead of us. The other 2 assistants were already there when I arrived. I will not use their real names, but instead will call the acclaimed surgeon Dr. Cheng while Dr. Zhao is an elderly woman who leads her research department. Canavero was the center of attention, as always, though, animated as he was with his passionate energy and explosive gesticulations. "My friends, we are very fortunate indeed," Dr. Canavero was saying. He ushered me in from the door, glancing both ways outside before securing it behind me. "President Xi Jinping has given us a gracious gift, one that I had long desired but hadn't yet dared to ask. Come, not that way." Dr. Canavero was practically prancing as he turned away from the usual route to our lab. It was almost surreal navigating the abandoned hallways that were typically bustling with life. The naked fluorescent lights burned with a gentle hum like the eternal pondering of an unseen jury. Chang answered my questioning look with raised eyebrows of his own as we turned to follow. "It's a risk, you know, what he's doing for us. Of course it will be to the glory of China if we succeed. But with an experimental procedure on the frontier between reality and science fiction, he's gambling with us." We were in the elevator now. I'd never been to the bottom floor before. You needed a special key to access it, but I'd always been told it was just storage space. Dr. Canavero's feverish excitement while he inserted his key told a different story. "We are already taking every reasonable precaution to prepare," Dr. Zhao began to reassure him. "But the thing about powerful men is," Canavero continued, ignoring her, "is that they don't remain in power by gambling. Not without a loaded die, at least." The elevator door opened on a long hallway with stairs at the end which continued spiraling downward. The first thing that impressed me was the enormity of the space. It must be as large as the rest of the facility combined. "We can't rig an operation," Dr. Chang snorted. "And even if we could falsify the reports, it wouldn't convince the scientific community for long. It would do nothing but further discredit your—" "I'm not talking about rigging the operation," Dr. Canavero said, leading us toward the stairs. "I fully intend to live stream the entire procedure for the whole world to see." "Then I'm afraid I don't follow," Dr. Chang started before being cut off again. Was that the echo of a shout from further down? In the sudden silence, we all heard it clearly again. Hoarse, strained, utterly hopeless, as though it had been calling on deaf ears for a long, long time, up to the railing with the other two assistants. "We're not going to rig the operation," I was the first to speak. The words were difficult to form in my mouth. "We're going to rig the preparation. The whole world will think they're watching something that's being done for the very first time." It was still a storage space of sorts, but it would be more accurate to call it a jail. The corridor was lined with cages barely large enough for their human occupant to stand. Below this floor ran another identical corridor with its own set of cages, and even more below that as far down as I could see. Thin hands grasped uselessly at the wire, rattling them in relentless excitement and fear. Others continued to lay on the ground, too broken or too hopeless to even turn our way. "While we've already successfully completed it, dozens of times." Dr. Canavero joined us to look down. "No play would ever be performed without a rehearsal, after all. The moment we accepted the research grants from President Xi Jinping, we've all become actors in his employ." "How many are there?" Dr. Zhao breathed a hot whisper. "Enough to make it a good show," Dr. Canavero replied. "Who are they, though?" I asked. "They're not victims, if that's what you're asking," Dr. Canavero said, turning back to the staircase. "At some point in all our lives, we have a choice, to become someone or to become no one. It's their misfortune that they decided the latter, although ultimately it was still their decision to make. I can only hope that my own team—" He stopped here, turning back to level his gaze on us. "That my own team has the foresight to recognize when they are making such a choice, and to do so more wisely." The implications were clear. Report the incident, it would be more likely that I ended up in one of those cages than it was for any of them to go free. Science is concerned with the truth, after all, not with how we got there. I took the first step toward the stairs, when a hand caught me by the arm. Some are likely to survive, though, aren't they? Dr. Zhao's face was pleading for something that I couldn't give her. I tried to force a smile, for her sake. Of course. That's the whole point, isn't it? We're just learning how to switch the heads. I knew it wasn't true even while I was saying it. Even the survivors would be buried with this secret, I had no doubt. That's when it occurred to me that my fate was likely inevitable for the same reason. Why would the government ever risk these methods getting out? That's why I'm writing this now, though, just in case something does happen. The first operation is about to begin, but I can't help but feel I'm the one about to go under the knife. Is it wrong that part of me is excited too? My family will be so proud when this is over. I'll be a hero. And don't all heroes walk on the bodies of those they couldn't save?
A few details before I start my story. I live in Northern California in a small townhouse with my girlfriend. I've decided to change the names of both people and places, just to be cautious. I don't want anyone going out to the beach I was trying to dig up clues, and instead found the trouble that I found. I'm sorry this is so long. I've tried to keep it as brief as possible. You have to understand that I've barely slept at all in days, and it's difficult for me to keep my thoughts in order. Saturday, March 26. John and I found the camcorder buried half in the sand on Stinson Beach. When I picked it up out of the sand, water leaked out from inside the camcorder. Sand was packed into every crevice, and the battery pack was missing. We dried it off with a towel and popped the cassette drive open. There was a digital cassette cartridge inside the drive. It had a yellow plastic head and a Panasonic logo, but no label or sticker attached. It seemed like the camcorder itself was pretty much trashed, but we figured it still might be possible to recover the data on the tape itself. I had an older Sony digital camcorder at home that used the same type of tape. I took the tape and camcorder inside with me when John dropped me off at home later that day. I set it down on my computer desk and forgot about it for almost a week. Thursday, March the 31st. John came over again next Thursday and saw it on my desk. I told him I had forgotten about it and hadn't even tried to play back the tape yet. We popped it into my Sony camcorder and hooked it up to my PC's FireWire port. Opened up Roxio's video capture application and told it to scan the tape for footage. Only one scene appeared on the screen. I will describe it to you as best as I can recall. A few feet in front of the camera is a woman. Her back is to the camera, and she is walking down a narrow dirt path, possibly even a deer trail. Tall, dry grass and small bushes line either side of the path. Based on the lighting, it is most likely sometime in the early morning or evening. The sky is cloudless and tinged with a soft orange color. Other than the shuffle of footsteps, the only thing that can be heard is seagulls crying and the soft sound of ocean waves breaking against the shore in the distance. She's wearing what used to be a one-piece swimsuit. The top half has been ripped or cut apart and now hangs down off her hips. She is naked from the waist up. Dozens of ugly red welts and cuts cross her back. It looks like she has been whipped or badly beaten with a stick. A length of thin rope, more like twine, has been used to bind her hands behind her back. The twine is wound so tightly against her wrists that you can see her hands have begun to turn a shade of blue from lack of circulation. The twine is cutting into her skin, and small rivulets of blood have run down her hands and fingers, dripping onto the dirt trail behind her. During the course of the scene, she only takes a few dozen steps. The clip is only 30 seconds long. Right before the clip ends, a man's voice can be heard. "Are you filming? You better not be filming yet. I told you to wait until we get inside." And then the clip ends. Both John and I were unsettled by that one short scene on the tape. It seemed authentic. Someone's home video gone horribly wrong. I tried to copy the clip to my computer, but every time we played the file back, it was just a mess of scrambled green lines with no audio. John took the tape with him when he went home later that evening. He wanted to try and use his MacBook and parents' camcorder to see if he was able to recover the clip onto his computer. He said maybe it was just a problem with my FireWire cable. It was the last time I ever saw him. Friday, April the 1st. At this point, I can't think of any unusual happenings. A normal Friday workday, no different from dozens of other Fridays before it. I called John to ask about the tape, but he said he hadn't had time to look at the tape again, but he was going to stop by his parents' house after work and borrow their camcorder for the weekend. Sunday, April the 3rd. John calls me. It was in the evening, sometime after 7, I think. He sounds excited and tells me he was able to get the clip to save onto his MacBook. The video plays back, but the sound is missing. I tell him to upload the video online, but he wants more time to try and get the audio to work as well. Wednesday, April the 6th. Unable to get a hold of John for 2 days. Calls are going straight to voicemail. Finally, he calls me on Wednesday, just as I'm getting ready to leave work and head home. I don't think I noticed it at the time, but looking back on events, his voice sounded odd. There was almost no inflection to his speech. It was flat and emotionless. I thought he was calling about the tape, but when I asked, he told me that it wasn't important anymore. He said he had found something, and we needed to go back to the beach. It took almost 2 hours to drive out to Stinson from my house, and I told him there was no way I was able to get out there on a weeknight after work, and even if I could, it would be nearing dark by the time we got out there. For some reason, this seemed to make him angry. I promised I'd go on Saturday with him, but this wasn't good enough. He said he needed to go that night, that there was something very important. He kept saying he had something to show me. I asked what, but he said I had to see it for myself. Finally, he called me a stubborn asshole and hung up. Thursday, April the 7th. John won't answer my calls. His voicemail says his inbox is full and won't accept any new messages. Friday, April the 8th. When I get up to take a shower in the morning, there is a small amount of wet sand spread out on the bottom of the tub. I think that maybe Sarah has only now gotten to rinsing her bathing suit out from the time we were at the beach 2 weeks ago, although I don't see her suit hanging up to dry anywhere in the bathroom. It's mildly puzzling, but I forget about it as soon as I leave for work. Only now do I realize that it was the start of the strange occurrences that were about to drive me into the frantic state I am in today. Later at work, my phone chimes, indicating that I have a voicemail. I hadn't noticed the phone ringing, but this isn't entirely unusual, as I don't have the best reception inside the office. It's certainly not the first time this has happened. I dial into my voicemail, and it's a message from John. He sounds calm again, no hint of his previous anger. I'm going back to Stinson again tomorrow morning. Meet me there. This is something I want to show you. I finish my workday and go home. I decide to tell Sarah about the tape and how it's making John act strange. But when I get home, she still hasn't gotten back from work. I make myself dinner and watch some TV, and there is still no sign of her. I call her work, and they tell me she left when her shift ended at 4 p.m. I call her mother in LA to ask if she's heard any word from Sarah, but she hasn't, and seems as worried as I am. I fall asleep on the couch watching TV. Saturday, April the 9th. Sarah was still gone when I woke up Saturday morning. There's no way I can go meet with John with Sarah missing. I go online and try and find any reports of traffic accidents on Friday evening, but there is nothing. Finally, I decide to call the sheriff's department. They tell me I can file a missing person report. There is no waiting period to do so. I give them all the details, and they promise to call me back as soon as they hear something. Sarah's mum calls me again in the evening. She is very upset that no one can find any trace of her daughter. Sunday, April the 10th. I awake from the most vivid nightmare in the early hours of Sunday morning. In the dream, I am sleeping in my bed, spooned up against Sarah. I wake up and I am freezing cold. The bed is totally soaked with nearly frozen water, and it reeks of salt and seaweed. Everything is wet. The mattress, pillows and blankets, everything. My arms are wrapped around Sarah, and her body is just as cold as the water, possibly even colder. I prop myself up and turn on the lamp next to my bed. Sarah is asleep on her side with her back to me, and I see that her arms have been bound behind her with twine. The knot is so tight that it's turned her hands blue, and there is a blood seeping from the cuts in her wrists. I am paralyzed by absolute terror, the kind you can only experience in a dream. Slowly, Sarah rolls from her side onto her back, and I can see her face. It's her, but She looks deformed. Her face is too broad, and her nose looks flattened and smashed, almost like she's pressed up against a piece of glass. Her eyes are bright and shiny. Her mouth is locked into a terribly wide grin. There are far too many teeth inside her mouth. She tells me there is something she needs to show me. I wake up in an empty bed, bathed in sweat and tangled in the bed covers. I swear I can still smell the ocean. Eventually, I leave the house to get food. On my return, I notice wet, sandy footprints leading from the grassy lawn right up to my front door. There is a wet piece of twine wrapped lightly around the door handle. When I untie it, I notice my hands have been stained a dull red. Monday, April the 11th. I couldn't sleep. I called into work and told them I was sick. I lay on the couch all day watching TV, and I have no appetite. At some point, I must have dozed off on the couch with the TV on. I wake up, and the TV is blaring noise. A local news report is on, and the news reporter is yelling, almost screaming his news report. It's a story about hundreds of dead bodies washing up on the beach last night, all of them with their hands bound behind their backs. He looks directly into the camera, almost like he's looking right at me, and says,
"You need to get down to the beach. There's something I need to show you."
The TV turns off. My apartment is freezing, and I can smell salt water. Tuesday, April the 12th. Another night of fitful sleeping, but at least no more dreams. I am exhausted from stress and lack of sleep. It's difficult to keep my thoughts in order. I called in work and told them I was still sick. For some reason, I don't want them to know about my missing girlfriend. In the evening, a deputy from the sheriff's department called me. He told me that they found Sarah's car abandoned in the parking lot near Stinson Beach. I tried asking him more questions, but he seemed very elusive and wouldn't give me any straight answers. I hope they don't think I'm a suspect in her disappearance. He told me that I needed to meet them at Stinson first thing tomorrow morning so they could ask me some questions. Shouldn't they want to question me at the sheriff's office? Before he hung up, he told me that it was imperative that I be at Stinson tomorrow. He said there was something he needed to show me. I called Sarah's parents' house, and her dad answered the phone. I told them about the deputy finding her car. He said it wasn't important anymore, and that everything was going to be okay. Just make sure you meet with the deputy tomorrow morning, okay? There is something you need to see. Tuesday, April the 13th. Another nightmare. God, I hope it was a nightmare. I'm so tired from not sleeping, it's hard to tell what's real and what isn't. In the dream, I was laying in bed again. The clock said 3:28 a.m. I woke up to a soft tapping noise coming from the bedroom window. I tried to ignore and go back to sleep. I hear the tap 2 more times, and then Sarah's voice. "Walter, I know you're in there. Please let me in. There is something I want to show you. Walter?" My bedroom window is on the 2nd floor. I ran downstairs, my gaze locked onto the floor, afraid of what I might see outside the window, even though the Venetian blinds were drawn closed. I fled into the small guest bedroom/computer office on the first floor and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The house is filled with the smell of seawater again, stronger than before. Wednesday, April the 14th. I am terrified and nearly mad with the need for sleep. I don't know what to do or who to ask for help. I know I can't stay locked in this room all day. I've decided to write this all down and post it online, someplace where people can read it, but possibly won't take it seriously. I'm afraid I won't make it back home ever again, but I have to go down to Stinson to talk with the sheriff. He's already called twice, asking me where I am, and if he shouldn't just send someone to pick me up and drive me down there. Hopefully, everything will work out okay, and I'll be back home this later evening.
My neighbor is one of those annoying wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself in lukewarm water, all the while screaming, "Epic win, epic fail," or fuck, epic maintenance of the status quo, for all I know. It can get tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame. So, when he knocked on my door the other day, told me he was going away for a few weeks, and asked that I could get his mail, honestly, it was kind of a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing that I didn't have to brace myself for any of his stupidity for a while. I was always afraid his stunts would wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then one evening I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to sender." Now, I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. Really friggin' heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder. And I quickly realized there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs and through my front door. I decided I'd leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car in there. The garage door was a piece of shit that refused to open without a good thug and a whack. It was less trouble just leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set the package down while I struggled to open the tricky door, but you know how it is when you've got a good grip on something. No point in setting it down if you don't have to. It was as I kicked the door for a third time that I lost my grip on the package and it fell to the ground. I heard a light crack inside. Shit. I hoped I hadn't broken anything important, but I figured I just wouldn't tell my neighbor about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands-free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck, and boy did it screech in protest as it rolled up and over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, sitting in the corner for whenever my neighbor would come back to claim it. And then I forgot all about it. Until a few days passed, that is. I'm not exactly sure how long it took for the smell to waft in from the crack under the garage to house door. But it came in a slow progression. It was a sickly sweet odor similar to a skunk. For the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that's exactly what it was. Roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realized that the scent was growing more intense instead of fading away that I went looking for a source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that's when the odor knocked me back, holding my nose. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. The only change in my garage was the box in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid from being left out of the fridge for so long. How much meat could have been in there in the box to have been so large and heavy? An entire friggin' cow? I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in hand. I probably wouldn't need them to open it, as it had become soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger, but I was not about to poke my finger into spoiled meat juices. The soggy bottom was the reason I had tried to open the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill out onto the floor. I was going to have to dump the pieces of meat in one garbage bag at a time, take them down to the dumpster. A process I was not looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape along the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell couldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new gamut of stink. It was like a burning oven, but instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of piss, sweat, shit, and putrefaction. It was so bad that I staggered back and had to force down the puke beginning to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled that scent mingling with the horrors coming out of that box. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran out the door for a breath of fresh air. But in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed a foothold in my home. I had to bite the bullet. I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open as though inviting me to look. I was prepared, a clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand, the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, and long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But, as it turns out, I needed none of those things. I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of that box. I would only have to suffer the nightmares every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or a pig. No, it was worse than that. It was my neighbor. Dead. Still in one piece, but dead. I called the cops. Naturally, they took me in for interrogation. It's kind of hard not to suspect the man with a corpse in his garage, after all. Thankfully, they soon realized I wasn't involved. My DNA might have been all over that box. The smell might have left a mark throughout my house. But there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbor's own hands that proved my innocence. A vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not sure if they were allowed to, or if they just felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbor was sitting in the box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He brought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours, or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbor recorded a few short clips about his progress. I think I'm in a truck now. I can feel it moving. Must be in a warehouse. Pretty warm in here. Still got plenty of food. That kind of stuff. And then, on the last entry, the box toppled over. He broke his neck, and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got full or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video, though. One thing I heard in the footage that will haunt me to the day I die. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door.